country implies that police were overwhelmed in many parts of the country, or at least that's what the LSK argues is the case, but says that that was not in fact the case, that the police are capable of handling the situation of peaceful protesters, and therefore the support of the Kenya Defence Forces is actually not necessary, as it would actually amount to intimidation and what would be seen as a police state. Wakili, earlier we were talking about the lack of public participation, the fact that the media was actually not involved when the National Assembly was voting to approve the Gazette notice, or this move by Aidan Duale, the Defence CS, to call on the KDF to move in to assist the National Police Service.
You see, when something is, we are a country governed by the rule of law, really, and that is why we have institutions like the National Assembly, and that is why there would be a law, that is Article 241, and equally the Kenya Defence Forces Act, which also speaks to the procedure, the procedure that the Cabinet Secretary for Defence may use in requesting for approval of deployment, and also speaks into how that deployment is going to happen. Now, the reason why this thing is normally taken to Parliament is because of public participation, because you remember Article 2 of the Constitution says that the Constitution is supreme, and that the people can either exercise their power directly or indirectly through their elected representatives. Now, when it goes to Parliament, it is a form of public participation, so that members of Parliament are able to weigh in on the reasons that the National Security Council or the Cabinet Secretary feels that we need to deploy the police. And in that request, the Cabinet Secretary ought to inform the National Assembly and at large now the public, because they are the public representatives, why we are deploying, or why we think the situation is dire and we need reinforcement and deployment of Kenya Defence Forces. And he also informs the public through the National Assembly when that deployment is needed and where. If those three things or those three elements are not there, then it is vague, and we are opening the floodgates of a police state.
Yes, and we spoke about the time frame as well. It is not clear for how long.
It is actually not clear because the way it is right now, we actually don't know for how long. The Gazette notice does not speak for how long. It does not speak for a specific part of our country that that deployment is going to happen, and it equally does not say why. And therefore, we are all left to assume and to guess and make guesswork. But remember, security apparatus cannot work with guesswork. If you want to slide into anarchy very fast, try uncertainty with security forces. Because if they don't have a proper command, there are all reasons and no possibilities of sliding into anarchy. So these are some of the things that the government and largely the executive needs to know, that when we are dealing with such an issue, it is good and it is proper advice that they deal with it in a more restrained manner. They need to consult. I don't know where the Honorable Attorney General was in this particular case, because he ought to have advised the President, he ought to have advised the National Security Council, and he also ought to have advised the Cabinet Secretary for Defense, so that such a scenario does not happen, where we are left to guess. The leadership of the defense forces they are left to just come on the streets, on whatever street you can imagine. They are not even elected legally.
Yeah, let's talk about the conflicting of roles and the rules that the military then, if at all, yes, this petition, is in favor, rather, or the LSK doesn't have its day, and the KDF is in fact deployed in terms of it assisting the National Police Service. Yes. In terms of, the rules that they must adhere to, we're talking about conflicting of roles and what the police can do and what the military cannot do. We're talking about, for instance, arrests. Yes. If a military officer arrests a civilian, should they then hand them over to the police? How then to avoid a situation where there will be conflicting roles, and whether they have a set of rules that or guidelines that they, now will be, called upon to adhere to if they are in fact yes, deployed?
Those are some of the issues that the Cabinet Secretary did not address himself to, because he never asked himself, when I said the troops, or when we deploy the troops to the streets, who is going to take charge? Is it the National Police? Is it the Defense Forces? And because the Kenya Defense Forces do not have holding cells, they do not have police stations. I mean, they do not have stations where they can keep civilians. They cannot prosecute civilians. So are they going to make arrests? And when they arrest, are they going to take people to prison? Where are they going to take people to? Are they going to take them to court tomorrow? Are they going to take them to police stations or hand them over to the National Police Service? So these are some of the questions that ought to have been answered. And the reason we are in this quagmire, and I will say maybe in the upcoming time, is lack of consultation, and I think, for lack of a better word, lack of competence. Because that Gazette notice was done in a rush. The Parliament the following morning rushed, and you have had several members of Parliament saying they were also not informed the way they are used to be informed to be in Parliament. So we actually even don't know whether there was quorum in Parliament. Yeah. We don't know whether it was debated. We don't know whether they followed their own standing orders, because it was actually in darkness, and we also don't have a communication from the Speaker. Yeah. So it is outrightly wrong for such a scenario to happen. It's actually very sad that a country which is a young democracy, but a democracy that is thriving, to slide into such uncertainty. And
let's go back to the issue we were talking about earlier. More arrests continue to be made, even as the protests continue. And there's the growing concern over police arresting protesters and holding them incommunicado. Many families are reporting their persons missing. Yes. People talking about persons that have been held days on end. Yes. And therefore concerns over what they are being held over for those that did not engage in destruction of property, and what the way forward would be for families or friends or guardians that are unable to access their loved ones who are still in custody.
And it's quite sad, Lillian, that people would be actually uncertain as to the whereabouts of their kinsmen after being picked from the streets by civilian police officers. You remember when this government was coming into power, they actually vowed that there will be no more abductions. They will never use the security apparatus or government institutions to settle political scores. And they said so on and so forth. But we have experienced this firsthand. Several Kenyans being arrested, abducted, and their whereabouts not being known, and only to be found at a police station somewhere in Kajiado. Yeah? Or somewhere outside Nairobi, or somewhere else. And that confirms to you that it is actually the state that has done that illegally. And actually, many people have been released without being released unconditionally. So why were they being arrested in the first place if they are not going to be taken to court? So I would also want maybe the police to adhere to Article 49 of our Constitution, that when you arrest someone, please tell them the reason why you have arrested them, process them properly, do not manhandle or use excessive force unless it is necessary according to the law, take them to the police station. If possible, grant those citizens bail, because it is a right. Give them police bond, release them, let them appear before a trial court, let them take plea, and their charges are read. If they are going to be granted bail by the court, fine. If they are not, fine. But let the due process take course as established by the law.
Right, and as of now, only a few minutes to almost just under an hour to when the High Court will declare its stand on whether or not the KDF will be deployed. As we await that ruling from Justice Mugambi, we are looking at the situation in various parts of the country. The pictures on your screen are from the Nairobi CBD, where police presence is Thursday, and a day after the president spoke in a televised address to the nation, saying that he had in fact heard the voice of the people. Protesters still took to the streets today and continued to protest against this finance bill, albeit the fact that the president seemed to have taken a more reconciliatory approach, a more conversational approach with the protesters, saying that he was, in fact, open to dialogue. We still have seen in various parts of the country that the Gen Zs, now joined by millennials and everybody else who chooses to be part of these protests, continues to air their opinions as regards the tax measures that were put in place there, or that were that were contentious in their opinion in that particular arrangement. And therefore, we will be following to hear from the High Court as we wait to hear whether the LSK will in fact have its day as regards whether or not the KDF is necessary in assisting the National Police Service contain the protests and the protesters in different parts of the city. Let's listen into what is happening there, whether those are pictures from earlier or not. That is Mombasa, and that was Mombasa earlier, where protesters also took to the streets, also airing their views and also chanting anti-finance bill slogans and saying that they will have their right of say heard, that they are a tired lot as regards the economic situation in the country, the cost of living, and really the fact that their voices have not been heard up to now continues to aggravate a significant lot. This moving from a Gen Z movement now to including anybody who is aggrieved as regards the state of the nation in terms of the finance bill and what it seeks to achieve, which they believe is not in the interests of the people. Police have sealed off major roads here in Nairobi County, and that continues to be the situation. And all roads headed or leading towards State House also continue to be inaccessible. The government has justified tax as a way to bring down the national debt, which currently stands at 68% of the GDP. Yet for many Kenyans, addressing the deficit hinges not on taxation, but according to what they say in their protests and the mood on social media, on addressing rampant corruption at every level of government. Protesters have talked about financial mismanagement. They've talked about lavish consumption among political elite. And this is where the bone of contention lies for many of them, among them young Kenyans, jobless, unemployed, who continue to say that enough is enough and that they want to be heard. The president yesterday, speaking to the nation in a televised address, declined to sign the Finance Bill 2024, and it was his hope, even after the deputy president spoke, that the Gen Zs and all the protesters would not take to the streets today. But that is not the case. They have, in fact, taken to the streets and continued with their anti-finance bill slogans and chants, saying that this bill will not see light of day. They call for its rejection. They call, in fact, for a rejection of the ideals that the government of the day holds. And therefore, looking at a situation where the current parliament is on recess and looking at the way forward, and the protest still ongoing, and a situation that now awaits in terms of the KDF's deployment, the ruling from the High Court, as the defense CS feels that it is necessary for the KDF to be deployed to help quell the situation as protesters continue to take to the streets, protesting what they say is high cost of living, unemployment, and really a bad state of affairs in the nation of Kenya. Wakili, we are, of course, just going to be hearing very, very shortly what the High Court has ruled. President Ruto has spoken about his administration working hard and consistently, pushing towards reduction of prices of essential commodities. He has spoken about unga, which has reduced from 240 shillings to 100 shillings. He's talked about reducing the cost of fertilizer from 7,000 to 2,500. He's also talked about the shilling strengthening against the dollar. So really saying that in as much as the protests are ongoing, that his government is doing everything they can to make the situation better for Kenyans. But even as he talks about the economic measures by his government, from the look of things here, the protesters feel that, these measures have not yielded results that have, soothed them or even calmed them down in any way. We had hoped that after yesterday, today, we would not see.
Yes.
Or rather, the government had hoped.
Yes.
That this would not be experienced again today after Tuesday, but still they are unrelentless.
Yes, and I'll tell you why maybe I think people continue to be relentless, because there is actually more than the Finance Bill 2024. There are problems as a nation, and our problems as the demonstrators are articulating them. You will hear it is more than the Finance Bill. It is more about governance, it is more about corruption, it is more about show of opulence outrightly by president's friends and handlers with very expensive stuff, show of outright disregard of the populace, disrespect and treating people with disdain by some of the leaders. You will see some of the members of parliament allied to the president. They even actually took to the social media when they passed the bill, and they actually seemed as if they were almost mocking the citizens. And these are some of the things that the people are telling the president, that we actually need to go back to the drawing board as a nation. We need to look more into our governance. We need to look at corruption cases. We need to see how many of them have been dropped legally, illegally, or unjustifiably. And we need to bring them, we need to apprehend those of your friends or those of Kenyans who have held high positions and continue to show opulence. And because some of them actually can't show anything apart from leadership that they have done, and yet they are able to marshal a lot of money. They are able to put on very expensive apparels. They are able to marshal very expensive cars. And you see the population is hungry.
Yeah.
And that is the reason, because there is no problem with having an expensive car. There is no problem with having an expensive cloth or owning something expensive, but there is every problem with you showing it off to people who are hungry, to people who are saying that this tax will make us go out of business, to people who are telling you, please, we plead with you, please, we plead with you, stop adding tax on diapers. Because when you add tax on diapers, we are going to suffer, because it is already expensive. It will become more expensive. We are going to close businesses when you put tax on some of the products. We are going to run out of business when you add tax on motorbikes.
Away from that, there's a question that's coming in, and this is a very curious observer here who is saying, I'm just wondering, why are we waiting for the ruling for deployment of KDF yet they're already in the streets? Does this mean that if the court ruling says they cannot be deployed, those already in the streets will be removed? What, he sees no sense pretty much in the fact that even before this ruling and, this being a court matter before the High Court, that we're still seeing the military.
And I will not fault him or her, because you would wonder what we are doing in court, whereas the defense forces have already been deployed. Like the executive has just decided, whatever comes out of that judicial process, we are going to proceed with our decision. But I'll answer him and tell him that we cannot just watch and just do nothing because they've had their way. The institutions and Kenyans must have their say. Let the due process take course. Let us get orders, whichever orders that will ensue from the ruling this evening. Whether the executive or the cabinet secretary for defense will obey them is an issue of discussion at that time. But let us first obtain directives, because we are a country governed by the rule of law, and because some people somewhere, maybe in government or elsewhere, have decided not to obey the rule of law and follow court orders, we cannot equally on this side of the divide say that we also are not going to follow the law. No, it's good to follow the law, because an eye for an eye, Lydian, it will leave the world blind. Yes. Yeah. So we need to not drop the guard. Yes.
We are continuing to get images from various parts of the country. The anti-finance bill protests now taking on a different approach, where we are not only seeing the Gen Zs engaging in the protests, but the entire country, and not an age-specific demographic, but anybody who really feels opposed to this finance bill situation, taking to the streets and airing their views, protesting. Most parts of the country experiencing peaceful protests, but still we have seen heavy police presence as police keep protesters at bay and keep them from accessing crucial public properties in parts of the CBD and beyond. Kenya continues to experience protests, and this despite an announcement by President William Ruto to put on hold the unpopular finance tax bill, which has sparked riots across the country. Police have set up roadblocks on streets leading to State House. They've also set up roadblocks in major city streets and those feeding into State House. And in an address to the nation Wednesday, that is yesterday, President Ruto defended, his move to raise taxes on certain commodities, saying it was necessary to reduce the country's massive debt. But he did admit to the public that he would not sign the bill. And this, of course, coming after violent protests earlier in the week on Tuesday, where several people died during protests against the finance bill, which led to a clash with the police as several protesters took to Parliament buildings, the Supreme Court, as well as the City Hall, which was on fire. The Parliament buildings also being destroyed, several parts of it, that is, and the Supreme Court. The bill won an approval in Parliament earlier in the week, but lawmakers proceeded to flee from Parliament, or rather make their way out of Parliament as protesters, really protested against this turn of events. And as, pressure mounted, hundreds of protesters from various parts of the country also joined in the protests, of course, leading to parts of Parliament being set on fire. And this was what then necessitated the president to come out. That was earlier in the week on Tuesday, to condemn protesters, storming of Parliament as treasonous and a threat to national security. That was earlier in the week. Human rights defenders have, however, come together to say that they are in support of the ongoing protests, saying that the protests were in fact peaceful and that the current leadership of the day should be in fact held accountable for the violence that was experienced, as well as the deaths of those who lost their lives in the ensuing protests. The Deputy President also coming out yesterday to address the nation, saying that he sympathizes with the current situation, that of the lives that have been lost, but calling on the protesters to hold back and allow for dialogue. Let us listen in to the President's address, televised address to the nation yesterday. Let's have a listen.
When I assumed office 20 months ago, our country was facing tremendous economic challenges. Escalating cost of essential household commodities, high fuel prices, rapid depreciation of the Kenya shilling, and spiraling public debt were threatening to ground our economy. My administration has worked hard and consistently so that today, the prices of essential commodities like unga have dropped from 240 shillings for a 2-kilogram packet to Kenya shillings 100, majorly attributed to our fertilizer subsidy program, the resilience of our farmers, and good rains that were given to us by God. During the period, we reduced the price of fertilizer also from 7,500 to 2,500. Petrol prices have come down from a high of 217 to now 187 a litre. The shilling has strengthened against the dollar from a high of 165 to now 127, 128. We in pulling the nation back from the brink of debt distress. Our debt situation is better managed, and our budget now has space for investment and in programs aimed at easing the hardship on vulnerable people and creating opportunities for our young people. Our GDP grew by 5.6% last year, ranking Kenya among the 27 fastest growing economies in the world. Our inflation figures have fallen from a high of 9 and 8 in May last year to 5% in April this year. It is instructive for the nation to know that for every 100 shillings we collect as taxes, we spend